The United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917, when the war was almost over. After the Allies had won the war in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles being signed, America emerged as one of the strongest countries in the world. We were told in school that America always wanted to stay neutral in conflicts like this. But is this really true? To understand the nuance of American politics at this time, we need some background knowledge. To do this, we can go to the turning of the century in 1900. After the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe and America, many countries were able to create massive amounts of product at cheaper prices. This also included military weapons, which would be important in the coming years. But when the year finally came in 1914 and World War I was fully in swing, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed that the United States would remain neutral. But in reality, this was a lie. He was heavily supporting the Allied powers such as Britain, France, and Russia through trade and loans. You might be asking, how do we know this? Well, we have the records from American banks, especially J.P. Morgan, who played a huge role in financing the Allied war effort. In 1915, Wilson's administration approved private loans to the Allies. J.P. Morgan became the official purchasing agent for the Allies. J.P. Morgan arranged $500 million in bonds for Britain, $100 million for France. Morgan also financed American companies like DuPont, Bethlehem Steel, and U.S. Steel to produce ammunition for the Allies. By 1916, the U.S. was supplying the Allies with more than $3 billion worth of food, weapons, steel, oil, and other goods, but giving almost nothing to Germany. Between 1915 and 1917, American banks loaned the Allies about $2.3 billion. Wilson's administration knew about this and approved these transactions. Just by this evidence alone, we can tell Wilson was never truly neutral. He heavily favored the Entente. But it doesn't end there. The U.S. became the arsenal and granary of the Allies. Factories made rifles, artillery shells, trucks, and uniforms. Farmers produced massive amounts of wheat, meat, and corn for European armies. American exports more than doubled between 1914 and 1917. And by early 1917, while thousands of Europeans were dying and starving, the U.S. economy was booming because of the war. Unemployment was low, and American industry was operating at full speed. Many people around Wilson were also pro-Entente. These people would include Edward M. House. He was Wilson's closest advisor, a very much pro-British diplomat who encouraged cooperation with the Allies. Another man is Thomas W. Lamont. He was a partner with J.P. Morgan and a key negotiator of Allied loans. Another man who influenced Wilson was Bernard Baruch, an influential Wall Street investor and later on Wilson's War Industrial Board. Even as the war went on, naval blockade became worse. The British Royal Navy used its dominance at sea to impose a naval blockade on Germany. Their goal was to cut off all trade like food, raw materials, and ammunition from reaching Germany and its allies. Britain declared the North Sea a war zone and forced neutral ships, including American ones, to stop for inspection or rerouting to British ports. This was a violation of international law, which allowed neutral trade freely in non-contraband goods. American ships carrying goods to Germany were seized or turned back, but the Wilson administration did not retaliate. Under international law, a neutral power had two choices: either trade equally with all parties or cut off all war-related trade entirely, but the U.S. did neither. Wilson allowed massive exports of weapons, ammunition, and food to Britain and France, while German access was completely blocked by the British Navy. In practice, this meant America was supplying the Allies with tools of war, while Germany received nothing. Then another problem arose, which was the smuggling of weapons and ammunition to the Allies. American factories openly produced rifles, shells, explosives, and aircraft engines labeled as commercial goods. These were shipped across the Atlantic on neutral American or British ships. They were often under false manifests. Some cargoes were disguised as civilian goods to evade German submarine detection. U.S. ports like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston became enormous centers of ammunition exports to the Allies. That's why German U-subs had a difficult time determining which ships were actually carrying civilians and which ones were smuggling weapons. For the Allies, sometimes it was both. An example of this was the sinking of the Lusitania. Germany had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, warning that any Allied ship, even civilian ones, could be attacked by submarine boats. At the same time, Britain was using civilian liners, like the Lusitania, to carry out war materials, as well as passengers between the U.S. and Britain. So when the Lusitania left New York on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool, there was already a public warning that such ships may be attacked. Before the ship even sailed, the German embassy in Washington, D.C. issued a very explicit warning. They placed newspaper notices in several major American papers, including the New York Times, right next to the Cardinal's advertisement for the Lusitania's voyage. Here's the exact wording of the warning, published April 22, May 1, 1915. Quote, "Notice travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." End quote. The Lusitania's captain, William Thomas Turner, was aware of the risk but believed the ship's speed at 25 knots would make it safe from submarines. But the Lusitania wasn't only carrying civilians. Later investigations and now declassified British records show that Lusitania was carrying war materials. This included 4,200 cases of rifle cartridges, 125 cases of shrapnel shells, and small arms ammunition. This meant the ship was a legitimate military target under German wartime rules. Germany knew the ship carried ammunition. That's why it issued such an unusual public warning. Germany saw this as a clear betrayal of neutrality. German diplomats protested repeatedly that the U.S. had become an economic partner of Britain. When the U.S. did not act to stop British seizures but condemned German submarine warfare, Berlin concluded that Washington was siding with the Allies. This culminated in unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, one of the triggers for the U.S. entry into the war. When Wilson went before Congress to seek a declaration of war, he wasn't trying to protect the United States from attack or imminent attack. His stated aim was to destroy German autocracy. He urged a crushing of the Central Powers. He famously promised the world would become safe for democracy. Furthermore, in 1915, a letter to Colonel Edward House, Wilson wrote that he sympathized deeply with the British and French cause, but could not say so publicly. House's diary from March 1915 records Wilson saying the U.S. should play a mediating role to bring about a favorable peace to the Allies. This comes from the intimate papers of Colonel House, Volume 1. So while Wilson talked about neutrality, his policies made the U.S. dependent on an Allied victory. If Britain or France lost, billions of dollars in American loans would never be repaid. Another factor that comes into the equation is the propaganda from the UK against Germany. Britain launched one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in history, and the United States was its main target. In 1914, the British created the Wellington House in London, the world's first state-sponsored propaganda bureau. Its job? To shape American opinion to favor the Allies and demonize Germany. Britain controlled the transatlantic cables, meaning most war news reaching the U.S. came through British censors. British officials selected, edited, or even fabricated reports that made Germany look barbaric. The most famous and effective campaign came after Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914. Britain spread stories of German atrocities, such as murder, rape, and the killing of children. Some of these were based on the truth. Civilian executions did occur, but many were exaggerated or entirely invented. The Bryce Report, which came out in 1915, was an official British document that described horrifying crimes. Later, many of these accounts were discredited as propaganda. These stories were reprinted across American newspapers, fueling outrage. Germans were depicted as Huns, savage machine-like killers. Posters, editorials, and pamphlets portrayed the Kaiser as a modern Attila the Hun, bent on destroying civilization, which was obviously not true. British media sensationalized German air raids and submarine attacks, one of them being the sinking of the Lusitania, which became a major propaganda victory. Although the ship was carrying hidden ammunitions, which Britain and the U.S. denied at the time, it was framed solely as a German crime against civilians. British agents and sympathizers worked directly with American newspapers, supplying news and editorials. Major American publishers like the New York Times and Harper's Weekly repeated these stories uncritically. Britain also placed lectures, films, and pamphlets across the U.S. cities promoting the Allied cause. Officially, the Wilson administration claimed neutrality, but did little to counter pro-Allied propaganda. Wilson's advisors, like Colonel Edward House and Secretary of State Robert Leasing, privately sympathized with Britain. The administration censored and discouraged pro-German voices, especially after the Lusitania incident. When German-American groups protested, they were branded as disloyal or foreign agitators. By 1917, much of the U.S. press and public viewed Germany as the aggressor and moral villain of the war, a shift driven heavily by propaganda rather than direct American experience. After the war, several British officers admitted that many atrocities or reports were exaggerated or false, one of them being Arnold J. Toynbee. He was an historian who worked for the British Foreign Office and Wellington House during World War I, helping produce official pamphlets. After the war, Toynbee became one of the first insiders to admit that British propaganda had gone too far. In a post-war interview, he said, quote, "We did not distinguish sufficiently between fact and rumor. We aimed to make people believe Germany was the sole criminal," end quote. Later, as a historian, Toynbee criticized wartime propaganda for corrupting public understanding of international affairs. Another one of these people spreading propaganda was John Buchanan. He was the director of the Department of Information, which succeeded the Wellington House. Later, Governor General of Canada and novelist of the 39 Steps. After the war, Buchanan admitted in his memoirs that propaganda required dramatization, and simplification. He said, quote, "You cannot make people act by pure reason. They must be moved," end quote. He conceded that emotional appeal often replaced strict truth. Another man, Lord Ponsonby, was a British diplomat and later Labour politician. After the war, he became a sharp critic of World War I propaganda and wrote the famous expose Falsehood in Wartime, containing an assortment of lies circulated throughout the nation during the Great War in 1928. He detailed many fabricated atrocity stories, like the Belgian babies on Bayonet Smith. Ponsonby wrote, quote, "When war is declared, truth is the first causality," end quote. The common view is that Germany did not want peace, but is this really true? Judging by how much propaganda was spread at this time, you have to look at the facts. By late 1916, both sides were exhausted, millions dead, food shortages across Europe. In December 1916, Germany made a formal peace proposal, often called the Peace of Understanding, or German Peace Offer. The Central Powers, like Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Empire, sent identical notes to the Allies. They proposed negotiations without preconditions, meaning both sides would sit down and discuss peace terms. Germany said they desired a peace of understanding rather than a dictated peace. The note emphasized restoration of Europe and a just and lasting peace. The Allies rejected it immediately, calling it insincere and a propaganda trick. Britain and France believed they were on the verge of victory. They were not, but their war effort was being fueled by America so they could keep fighting, and they refused to negotiate with an aggressor. The Allies wanted Germany to first renounce its gains and accept war guilt, terms Germany would not accept at the time. Just after this offer, President Woodrow Wilson issued his own Peace Without Victory message in January 22, 1917. Publicly, Wilson called for a peace based on compromise, but privately his administration leaned toward the Allied interpretation that Germany's offer was a ploy to divide the Allies. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare days later, Wilson broke relations, and the chance for peace was lost. Pope Benedict XV also tried to stop the slaughter. He sent a note to all parties proposing mutual disarmament, evacuation of occupied territories, freedom of the seas, abrogation of future disputes. Germany and Austria-Hungary responded positively, and they said they were willing to discuss terms. The Allies, especially France and Britain, ignored it or responded vaguely. Wilson refused to support the papal plan, arguing that autocratic governments like Germany's could not be trusted to maintain peace. Instead, he wanted a regime change in Germany, a condition for any peace, a shift from negotiation to a moral crusade. But in the East, it was a different story. Germany, alongside her allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were going deeper into Russian lands. The atmosphere in Russia in the beginning was an uproar of patriotism. They even renamed their capital, St. Petersburg, to Petrograd to sound more Russian. This wave of patriotism didn't last long because the army was in no condition to be fighting this war. Tsar Nicholas II wanted to support his Slavic ally, Serbia. That was the reason he even entered the war. But unfortunately, he had more pressing issues, one of them being the politically unstable climate of Russia during this time. The communists were causing massive problems for him. They wanted a total revolution, which meant destroying everything that took centuries to build. But more importantly, how did Woodrow Wilson play a part in Russia's involvement during this war? Russia, part of the Allied powers, benefited from U.S. loans and supplies. But Wilson's focus on democracy and human rights made him critical of autocratic Russia, creating tensions with Tsarist Russia. Wilson's stance did not strengthen moderate reformers in Russia. It mostly reinforced Russia's dependence on external support and internal unrest. After the Tsar had abdicated and the Bolsheviks took power, there was a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the provisional government. Wilson's administration hesitated to support the provisional government, militarily or financially, offering mainly moral support. This created a vacuum of strong international backing for moderate democratic forces in Russia, leaving them vulnerable to the Bolsheviks. Wilson authorized limited military intervention in northern Russia and Siberia. His goal was to protect Allied war supplies sent to Russia and support anti-Bolshevik forces. The intervention was small and poorly coordinated. It exposed American troops to Russian internal conflict, antagonizing both Reds and even some Whites. This strengthened Bolshevik propaganda, portraying them as defenders of Russian sovereignty against foreign invaders. This was a half-hearted attempt by Wilson and caused more harm than good. But Russia was economically dependent on America to keep fighting. Through J.P. Morgan, the U.S. provided loans and arms to the Allies. The Tsar and then the provisional government relied on Allied supplies to continue fighting Germany. This kept Russia in a prolonged war, worsening domestic hardship such as famine, inflation, and labor unrest. Soldiers and peasants increasingly lost faith in moderate governments, making revolutionary rhetoric more appealing. Wilson's moral diplomacy meant he was reluctant to work with non-democratic factions, even if they were anti-Bolshevik. This alienated moderate anti-Bolshevik forces, leaving the Bolsheviks as the most organized revolutionary alternative. Essentially, Wilson's idealism did not match the reality on the ground, which contributed to political fragmentation. Thanks to Wilson's misguided policies, the Bolshevik coup led to the 7 decades of Soviet communism. Historian R. J. Rummel estimated that almost 62 million people were killed by the Soviet government. He estimated that all the 20th century communist regimes killed between 110 million and 260 million people. Now that Russia was out of the war, Germany could focus on the Western Front, planned by General Erich Ludendorff in early 1918. Their goal was to break the stalemate on the Western Front before U.S. forces could fully mobilize. Germany moved over 50 divisions from east to west. One of these operations was called Operation Michael in March. They struck the British lines near the Somme, and Germany advanced 40 miles, the deepest movement since 1914. Paris was only 70 miles away, and the Allies were on the brink of collapse. But the arrival of fresh U.S. troops were able to stop the advancing Germans. Without these fresh U.S. troops, the Allies might have collapsed in the summer of 1918. And if the Central Powers had won, then Wilson would have lost all the money he gave, and the banks have given to the Allies. They would have lost $3 billion, which equals roughly around 80 to 90 billion in today's money. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, which ended the war in 1919. Wilson's top priority at the Paris Peace Conference was not just to end the war, it was to create a new world order, which wars like this would never happen again. For Wilson, the way to do this was through the League of Nations. It was an international organization that would help mediate disputes, stop aggression, and uphold collective security. Wilson opposed punishing Germany too harshly. He wanted reparations only for civilian damages, not for the cost of the whole war. But France and Britain insisted that Germany pay massive reparations and accept full blame. This is in Article 231. Ironically, Wilson made a lot of compromises so that the Allies would join the League of Nations. The great tragedy was that the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. So all the compromises Wilson made, the harsh reparations, the colonial mandates, the war guilt cause, remained in place, but the one institution that might have balanced them was crippled. Wilson's dream of peace without victory turned into a peace built on resentment and hypocrisy. Wilson and his administration made this war worse than it needed to be, and set the stage for another conflict in the future. Thank you for watching and reaching the end of this video. If you have any thoughts about this topic, let me know what you think in the comments.